Hello, everyone who's here. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kadhiga Waroe, and I'm the program's assistant at the Nairobi Contemporary Art Institute. Today's conversation takes place as part of the programming for our ongoing exhibition, Olidde Mupipa, which is Xenson's first ever solo exhibition in Nairobi and his first institutional exhibition in East Africa. With an emphasis on sculpture and installation, the exhibition brings together 6 newly produced works, which broaden Xenson's exploration of objects and materials, and the stories they tell about the specific cultural context from which they're drawn. Our speakers this afternoon are Xenson and Sunny Dolat. Xenson is a multimedia artist from Kampala who uses diverse mediums like sculpture, Xenson uses sculpture, installations, and painting to explore themes of identity, consumerism, and cultural global circulation. His work is distinguished by a vibrant aesthetic, using found and recycled materials and drawing on his upbringing to incorporate organic elements like backcloth. Xenson aims to preserve indigenous knowledge while engaging with contemporary issues, particularly humanity's environmental impact. He has exhibited internationally, including at the Venice Biennale 2024 and in various galleries across Uganda and beyond. He's a graduate of Makerere University, and his pieces are part of collections at notable museums. He has also founded an art space called Xenson Art Space to support emerging artists. Sunny Dolat is a renowned Kenyan curator and a creative director, celebrated for shaping contemporary African fashion aesthetics and narratives. Over a decade-long career, he has been pivotal in the African fashion and creative industries, advocating for authentic representations and sustainable practices. Dolat's work spans various capacities and advisory roles, with his contributions recognized globally, including in his 2023 inclusion in the BOF 500 list by the Business of Fashion. His inclusion underscores his impact on redefining African fashion and his role as a thought leader in the industry. Recently, he co-curated the African Fashion Exhibition at the Victoria Albert Museum in London and presented an installation with the Nest Collective at Documenta 15. Our moderator today is Chepkemboi Mang'ira. She is a decolonizing fashion activist and founder of Own Your Culture. Her work focuses on showcasing the relevance of ancestral Kenyan fashion using mediums such as digital media, design, writing, lectures, and festivals. Own Your Own Culture platform is a curated ancestral art design research space where she explores the themes of identity and belonging in a post-colonial globalized world to reverse the negative effects of colonialism on Kenyan fashion. She is also a curator of the Global Fashioning Assembly Biennale. Please note that this conversation will be recorded and will be available to view online afterwards. I'll hand over to Chepkemboi, who will then take over the session. Karibuni.
Thank you, Kadhiga. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We shall have a Q&A at the end, so you can write down the questions that you have or any questions that may come up, and then we shall address them as we get towards the end. Now I want to jump straight into the conversation, and I want to start with looking at cloth and objects as memory holders. So Xenson, in your current exhibition, your use of everyday objects, and even in your work with backcloth, in your previous shows, you talk about how seeing backcloth brings back childhood memories. Well, Sunny, in your latest exhibition, you talked about you showcase how textiles tell stories beyond what is obvious at first sight or touch. Can you each speak on that? You can start with Xenson.
Yes, welcome everyone. Yeah, the concept of textile as a tool for storytelling, especially backcloth, maybe I could begin from that as a departure point, is that backcloth in itself has been gazetted by UNESCO as a fabric for knowledge, indigenous knowledge, the highest form of indigenous knowledge. So this is done because it's believed that just the process of making backcloth is an ingenious process, and it takes a bit of it's a high form of intellect to actually to make backcloth. So growing up, again, that brings us to the memory, childhood memory. My first interaction with backcloth was actually in primary school, in our dance and drama club, where it was used as costume, mainly as costume. And then my next interaction with backcloth was at a burial of an uncle. So these two layers or two formations are pertinent in actually how I look at and how I use backcloth. Obviously, the other thing about backcloth is it's a very sustainable material. It's made out of the bark of a tree. So the concept of conservation and what we call obulungi wensi is part and parcel of backcloth in itself, because the tree itself before you can be harvested for up to 50 years. So many backcloth can come from one tree for up to 50 years, because it's the process of preserving the tree itself so that there is a regeneration process, which again you come back and make a new backcloth. So these are layers that I play around with. And obviously, with time, backcloth has been used in families, to make products, to make a craft. And I think I'm adding to that discourse of, as an artist, of adding another layer, but also adding a personal voice to that. So that in a way also correlates with the work that I'm presenting in. Right now, I may not go into the details, but I think briefly that's why, in a way, backcloth becomes part and parcel of how I use materials, or my materiality in the way I do my art. So yeah.
Yes. And also now I want to also hear from Sunny's side on the same.
Afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Chepkemboi, for the question, and thank you, Xenson, for that really beautiful explanation. I've always been really interested in the ways in which cultures from across the continent utilize textiles in such a variety of ways. One of the things that we always hear about African cultures is that they're cultures where oral histories are central. And I think that that's true, but I also think that textiles have always played a really central and integral part to histories and documentation, as well as communication. And maybe just to share a few examples, in East Africa, we have the very famous kanga, which is a Swahili cloth, sort of inspired by the Portuguese cloth called lenço. So again, depending on what word you prefer, some people will call it kanga, some people will call it lesso. But the way that the kanga is used for me is really fascinating, because if you know sort of like the anatomy of a kanga, is that you have the sort of like central part that bears the motif, you have the border, and then you have the misemo, which usually sits at the bottom. And the text that's born on the kanga often is captures a variety of scenarios and circumstances, as well as emotion. And historically, the kanga has always been used as a tool by Swahili women to communicate, whether the communication is a little bit catty or like a little bit subversive, whether it's a bit like romantic, whether it's to communicate grief. It really speaks for the women and that culture who wear it and use it. And so there's a way in which, in sort of like both public space and wider society, there's a way in which the kanga is activated by the wearing and the ways in which that the women use it. Other examples are if you look at mud cloth from Mali or Bogolanfini and the marks and motifs that it bears. One of the interesting things that I read is some researchers believe there's one particular pattern of mud cloth that sort of like bears this sort of like almost like, to be reductive, they look sort of like zeros and ones. And there's a school of researchers who believe that that is actually some of the earliest forms of binary code that exist. Because if you look at the arrangement of that pattern, it clearly is to communicate something. So again, looking at these textiles as documentation, or rather as like pieces of historical documents. But also further to look at the way that textiles are used to honor or mark different occasions. So you have a series of textiles that are used to swaddle children when they're born. You have textiles like the lamba mena from Madagascar that are used as funeral shrouds to sort of like honor people at the moment of departure. And this is historically how across the continent we've used and continue to use textiles as communicative tools, but also as extensions of tradition, culture, and heritage.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I want to go back to something that also Xenson touched on about sustainability. So the artwork on the poster of the rubber person who is caught up in a mousetrap, which is from Xenson's current exhibition, which alludes to being trapped in our unsustainable production and consumption processes. And of course, a huge issue that is in the fashion space right now and even in the world is about sustainability. And Sunny, you also tackled that, like you've tackled the murky underside of fashion sustainability in your Return to Sender installation. Xenson, can you speak about your observations when you're creating the piece that was on the poster? And Sunny, can you talk about your work with fashion sustainability?
Kamas is the title of the work, and for me it's like it is Kamasu, it's a trap, and that trap goes full circle. Obviously, for instance, the bells, the second-hand clothing, mitumba, or in Uganda we call them mivumba. Sometimes they are given as aid or charity, but somehow they find themselves in the markets and being sold. But the bigger picture is we are in a cycle of consumption. So we are trapped in this cycle that does not end, whether it's social politics, the politics of oil, the brand names, you know, the fast fashion, you know, and especially in Africa, if you look at like Le Sape in the Congo, and most of Uganda and I believe in Kenya, most people want to buy, they're caught up in the cycle of the Gucci's and the LVs, and you know, so I believe that's a trap, you know, because our ancestors used to wear clothing for more than 10 years without really buying new clothing, and they had a way of cleaning them. Like if you look at the Karamojonge in Uganda, they used oil to like to repair their skin clothing. So the trap, it's the imagery of that piece basically talks about us being in this cycle, being trapped by I think Americans call it I call it the essence of the name skips me, but the consumption, the unending consumption. In fact, they say that Black African Americans are the biggest consumers of luxury goods. So we are caught up in this unending cycle. I guess briefly that's what I can talk about. But it's also, of course, obviously talks about, because it's also recycled barrel. So it also talks about the politics of the oil, like in the Delta region, where the oil comes from, the people remain poor. But this oil actually, and I always talk about the global circulation of culture, and the question still remains who benefits. But this oil goes as crude, mostly from Africa. Then it's taken to Europe that possesses the refineries, and then it's brought back in barrels. So again, that cycle, you can call it trade, you can call it consumption, but again, it's a cycle that is really an endless. So basically it talks about the different layers, the metaphorical of being trapped, or being even candy, like candy. You go into a store, and it's what is really through marketing and branding and advertising, it's what it is anyway. So yeah.
Maybe just to pick up on something that Xenson has said that for me really resonates is this trap that we find ourselves in. I think that the global media machinery has been incredibly successful in relentlessly convincing us that we need more always and endlessly, that we need more clothing, we need more stuff that will make us more fashionable, more stylish, more desirable. And, a couple of years ago, a couple of decades ago, maybe you're only getting this from like TV and the magazines, but now you're getting it from TV, from magazines, from every single social media platform that exists. And so it really is relentless. And so you find a lot of people falling into this trap. You use the word sustainability, and I struggle with that word a little bit because I feel like it doesn't carry enough nuance for the different practices of sustainability that exist across the world, particularly in the global south, and sustainable practices that have been embodied for centuries by indigenous communities. Again, to touch on something that Xenson mentioned, across the continent, we have such an intimate and almost sacred relationship with clothing. And I think there's a couple of theories as to why that is. One perhaps is that we have such close proximity to the processes and of the processes of the making of clothing. We know what it takes to grow cotton. We know what it takes to make a shirt, because a lot of us grew up, with sort of like access to a tailor. So you know that a shirt takes a couple of days to make, and so there is that awareness that clothing takes time and resources to be made. And so I would like to give the example, like for us on the continent, and again, much of the global south, it's so uncommon to throw away an item of clothing. The more common practice is that once something doesn't fit you anymore, maybe once something you don't like it anymore, you'll give it to like one of your siblings, you'll give it to a cousin, you'll give it to a friend. And so clothing often has these really, really extended life cycles. And at the very end of its life cycle, it'll become like a rug somewhere in the house, And I think that many of us have always grown up with this awareness. And so there's an understanding and a way that we interact with clothing that is inherently sustainable. When we talk about the word to sustain, that's exactly what we mean. When we talk about the labor of sustaining, that's this labor. And maybe to touch a little bit on the work Return to Sender, which we first presented in 2022. Kenya, like most of the continent, have been receiving secondhand clothing for at least the past 3 decades now. Different parts of the continent receive different quantities, but Kenya is definitely one of the largest importers of secondhand clothing on the continent. And one of the biggest challenges with secondhand clothing is that because we are importing from the global north, as the quality of clothing sort of reduces in the global north, as fast fashion becomes more and more popular in the global north, that's actually what most of the bale is made up of. When we're researching the work, traders were telling us anywhere between 60 to 50% of every single bale is completely unsellable. It gets to Kenya and it goes straight to Dandora. Dandora was declared full over a decade ago, but there's nowhere for this sort of like clothing to go. So every day there's like trucks that go to Dandora to dump these clothes that can't be sold. And so the work titled Return to Sunday is really a statement around, one, the really problematic dynamics of secondhand clothing. Anyone who's familiar with secondhand clothing, you know that when you go and buy a bale, you have no idea what's in the bale, right? Because it's completely closed. All you know is that like, it's a bale of shirts or a bale of trousers. And so the purchase of every single bale is essentially a gamble. And this is something that the global North absolutely takes advantage of. So they use this trade as a moment and an opportunity to smuggle textile waste from the global North into the global South. And then the management of this textile waste becomes our responsibility. And even at times when we've tried to sort of like want to reduce the volume of secondhand clothing that we're importing or just ban it, like we tried to in 2016 as the EFE, then you have the global North responding with such violence in the same way that the American government did by threatening to remove us from AGOA. And they ended up removing Rwanda from AGOA because Rwanda went ahead with a plan to ban secondhand clothing. And so the trade of secondhand clothing is so problematic and so sinister, because on one hand, the language that's used to justify the movement of this clothing is that of assistance. It's donation from the global North into the global South. But this trade is so incredibly profitable for the global North. So not only are they making money from selling these donated clothing to us, but they're also able to outsource the work of waste management to us, and sort of like use their laws to ensure that these streams of waste continue to come in. So the work was just sort of like to highlight all of these problematic dynamics that still bear the legacies of imperialism and colonialism, because that's what keeps these active.
Thank you for those insights. Touching on that, Xenson, your work primarily, a lot of your work is focused around using found objects. Can you speak about what your inspiration is around that, especially using specifically items like rubber? I've seen that a lot in your fashion and art collections.
Yeah, rubber in a way comes in 3 layers of inspiration. First, it's the tires that I usually look out for are the organic tires that come from organic rubber from the trees. So that's why I try to use it again with backcloth, because there is a correlation there. Backcloth coming from the trees and rubber coming from the trees. And then the other layer is the layer of the ingenuity, the processes of making what we call lugabire or sandals, the Masai sandals, for instance. Those come from recycled rubber. But I try to use, there are certain things or offcuts that are not used. So those ones, I try to find a way of using those other offcuts that find a way of, instead of losing them, but use them in my work. But also the process itself, how can I use this process and incorporate it into my work? Because these processes have become artisanal in a way over time. So for me to borrow or to be inspired by these processes, and also the byproducts of making these sandals, what else can come out? So that's another layer. And the third layer is really the layer of the social politics, where in most of Africa, if there is a riot or if there is a demonstration, most youth go on the streets and sometimes burn tires. Sometimes it's even they could even ban people, mob justice. So that layer of what can I call it? It's so that's another layer that I look at in terms of self-expression. It could be negative, it could be positive, but the riots, the demonstrations in most of Africa, actually even in Europe. So that other layer again adds to the story for most of my, especially for some of the work that I talk about, you know, like suffocation of political opponents or engaging free speech or free expression. So those are the different, the three layers that I use the rubber in my work, really. In addition to really being a very flexible and obviously something that I find in my environment that I can reuse. Also, of course, it brings in the element of recycle. Yeah, but basically those are the three layers, that the reason why I use rubber, really.
Thank you. I want to also go back on talking about bark cloth. Sunny, as a textile expert, can you explain to everyone how bark cloth works, the sensitivity of bark cloth, so that they can understand, you know, how Xenson manages to mix bark cloth and rubber?
Sorry, I actually feel like Xenson might be better placed to explain, but I can definitely share from my perspective. So bark cloth is, as the name suggests, it's literal tree bark, and it's derived from a tree called the Mutuba tree. So the bark of the tree is peeled and then hammered into these really like thin sheets, and that's essentially really what bark cloth is. Xenson, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, bark cloth is also so that's the basic. But bark cloth for time immemorial has also been used in by the royals as a natural material because of its effects on the skin, you know. But also beyond that, bark cloth is used as a mummifier. That if you're buried in bark cloth, your body remains intact for up to 500 years. That's why Baganda, people of Uganda, buried. In fact, not just Buganda, but it's the same material that the Egyptians used to bury their dead, because it has that mummifying effect. So that's another layer of bark cloth. Of course, the other layer is it's also medicinal if you go deep into that. But also the Mutuba tree is a very essential tree in terms of our lineage as Baganda. It's one of the pillars when there is a phenomenon of walking like a Muganda. It means you have to name your like 10 generations of your ancestry. And each of that generation must have a Mutuba. A Mutuba is a tree where below it was a fireplace. So as you name all your ancestors, each ancestor must have a Mutuba. So you find that if those are 10 Mutubas, if you name 10 generations, so that's another layer. Obviously, the other layer. Hello?
Anyway, in the meantime, as we wait for Xenson, Sunny, you talked about how designers are custodians of heritage or purveyors of history. Can you talk about what your observation has been as a cultural producer, seeing how designers and artists, craftspeople and artisans have been sort of custodians of heritage.
Actually, and I see Xenson has joined, so maybe I'll let Xenson finish his thought and then I can respond to that question.
Sorry, yeah, so I don't remember where I was.
You were talking about the Mutuba tree and every ancestor having a Mutuba tree.
Yeah, within the lineage. So yes, the backcloth and the Mang'ira and a great part and parcel of our ancestry. I think briefly that's what I can say. And of course, people have gone ahead to add value, to reuse it in culturally, also artistically, and there are so many experiments and a lot of research is going on how to improve backcloth and also how to make it more durable, washable, and all that. But like you said, you're talking of the kanga and all this. Mutuba tree is Mutuba. I mean, the backcloth itself is a unique cloth, and I think also to you. That line of Golani, it has become an a unit is among the. I think there are 12. Briefly, I think that's what I could say about the backcloth.
Thank you for that, Xenson. And it's actually interesting to hear some of the ways in which backcloth is used, and there's so many parallels with other textiles across the continent. One that comes immediately to mind is indigo cloth from Mali, which, similar to backcloth, is sort of, poetically speaking, the first fabric that a child is wrapped in and the last fabric that someone is wrapped in when they're buried. And I think that this really sort of like connects to the thought that we had earlier around that textiles and the way that textiles are situated in our cultures. Sorry, Chepkemboi?
Oh no, just go on, Sunny.
Okay, sorry. There was a strange sound, so I thought I was cutting out. But yeah, just to say that like that's such a beautiful story about the ways in which backcloth is situated in Baganda culture, but also just in wider Ugandan culture. And to your question, Chepkemboi, around designers and as sort of like custodians of heritage and knowledge, I think when you talk about custodianship and we talk about the preservation of cultural heritage, I don't think that designers are credited enough for the labor of preservation that they do. If you look at the work of several artists that I can name, a good example who we featured recently in the traditional exhibition is Patricia Mbella, and Patricia's current practice centers beading cultures and beading practices from across Kenya. And it's knowledge that she has sort of relearned and excavated over the past decade. And some of those cultures, like Taita beading culture, and Patricia as a Taita woman, she has managed to revive, because like many beading cultures in Kenya, Taita beading culture was decimated under British colonial rule. It was deemed as witchcraft, and so therefore actively discouraged, and that discouragement was sometimes politically enforced. And so Taita beadwork completely disappeared. And between 2003 and sort of like 2014, after being able to access a sample of Taita beadwork from the Nairobi Museum archive, Patricia has worked really tirelessly to teach herself that beadwork and to revive it and teach her cousin. And for me, there's no better example of custodianship of heritage and knowledge than that. And that we see it in the works of several designers working across the continent who center, whether it's traditional materials, or silhouettes, or processes in their work, that they are the reasons that these textiles and processes are able to continue, because we have to be honest in that in today's hyper-capitalistic world, by nature, these processes tend to be very slow, very time-consuming. And so if you're someone who is thinking about efficiency in the very sort of like capitalistic sense, these processes and techniques are not efficient because they're incredibly laborious. However, these designers, makers, and artisans are providing the necessary capital incentive for these knowledges to exist and for these knowledges to continue to enter public space. And I think that that's really important. That really is what custodianship is about.
And tying on to that, I want to ask Xenson about your practice. What is involved for you to, to tell these indigenous stories, or to maintain this or showcase this indigenous knowledges in your works? What is the process involved in that?
Before that, if I can add to what he was saying, the backcloth itself was demonized again, and so to use it, actually, for me, it's a counterproductive way of preservation, but also of trying to the Ugandans, of trying to kind of decolonize their mind to the backcloth, because of Christianity and religion. It was demonized and pushed to the peripherals, of witch doctors. So as designers, we do, I think, a great job to use it and make it good again, So that's really, really very important, because as more designers, as more artists use it, then it becomes part and parcel of the fabric of our society, and also of preservation and nurture of our cultural heritage. My work, actually, most of the departure points are really from really my culture, my traditions, language especially. I draw a lot of inspiration from proverbs, from folklore, from sayings, and try as much as possible to relocate them into contemporary culture. As you might know, I come also from the background of hip hop, spoken word, poetry. So so my work derives really from that. I can give an example of the work in Kai. Most of that work, actually, most of the works are derived from proverbs or from riddles or from sayings. One is the mukeka. A mukeka is the mat, but we have a saying that nina mukazi wange aluka emikeka mingi naye atuula ku ttaka. That I have my wife who weaves many mats but sits on the ground. So that saying, for me, is, if I relate it or if I bring it into contemporary culture today, and for instance, talk about the barrows and the oil, that Africa has some of the biggest depots, or we can even say that Africa has the most resources, but it still remains the poorest continent, So that's I use that saying or that proverb to bring it into contemporary use. So most of my work really revolves around those layers. The other layer that is between, again, in that work of Mukeka is, again, it's a riddle that nina mukazi wange aluka omukeeka teguggwaayo, that I have my wife, she makes this smart that never ends. So again, if you look at that, it's the inspiration for that for that work, Mukeka, is you see there is still room to add and add and add. But then also the question becomes, for how long shall Africa keep giving? Or for how long, who can put a stop to this phenomenon of sniping Africa's resources, you know? So so my work really revolves, even music. So I guess I'm making a bit of I don't know if I'm answering your question, but most of my inspirations really come from things like this, including the trap. There is a saying that enongo sereza yassa semitego, that if you're laying a trap, you have to know when to stop, you know, or else it might trap you yourself, or you spoil the trap and then have to go back again. You know, you have to, you have to go into the whole cycle once again because you took too long, or you didn't know when the trap is ready. So there are all these layers that are inspired by my language, that my sayings and traditions, and they are very relevant for today, really. Because if you look at these are almost 800 years old proverbs, sayings, folklore, but I still believe that in the next 800 years, they'll still be relevant because they've guided us, they've guided our ancestry, and they've guided our morals up to today, you know? And I think they're still relevant. It's up to us to use them into contemporary culture, you know, place them into, as we question as we question the status quo. It's good to be inspired by,
Thank you for that insight, Xenson. I also want to, on the final topic, to just touch on the importance of the importance of using objects or materials as a way of finding our histories or identity, or reframing our historical narrative. So for Xenson, there you worked with things like backcloth when you do your poetry in your languages. And then for Sunny, how designers have obviously used objects and materials as a way to sort of reframe and find their own history and tell a different story.
I don't think who should go first, but I'm happy to go first. I think these continued explorations of indigenous materials and processes is really important, because what happened, and it was interesting to hear Xenson say that backcloth sort of like faced the same thing that many beading cultures in Kenya did, which is that they were either demonized either by the church or by the colonial government, is that many materials and knowledges were completely marginalized. Some of them completely disappeared, and some of them managed to persist a little bit. And what these continued explorations do is, when we talk about decolonial labor, this is, I think, in many ways, the definitions of decolonial labor. This revisiting of our histories, of our past, and the ways in which we approach materials, the ways in which that we approached making, the values that we held is really sits at the heart of decolonization. But it's also because so much of these indigenous practices and knowledge were inherently sustainable. So, over the past decade, people have been talking quite a bit about sustainable dyes or like organic dyes. And in much of the sort of like the global south, indigenous communities have worked with organic dyes for centuries. If you look at the kamba from Kenya, for instance, the baskets that they make, the kiondos, are all dyed using soil predominantly, but also the bark, leaves, and branches of different trees, and that this knowledge is completely undocumented, right? I remember a couple of years ago, so like doing a bit of research within these communities, and literally what it was people pointing to like a tree to be like, that tree, if you use the leaf of it, you get yellow. If you use the root of it, you get gray. If you use like a young branch, you get like a shade of green. And I think that these knowledges, when we talk about sustainability, these knowledges really are the solution, because again, to repeat myself, they were and are inherently sustainable and can really offer us a sort of like new frame to think about sustainability and develop sustainable solutions. Xenson, over to you.
Maybe also to add, actually, these are well documented. It's just that they're documented. Like they say, the elders. I mean, when an elder dies, the library has banned. He's gone with the whole library. So I think we just need to make more films, to documentaries about, especially the old people, because they are the connoisseurs, the custodians of this knowledge. They know the medicinal, the indigenous medicines. They know the indigenous, most of them actually, including, I mean, I'm just learning a lot about backcloth from older people, which trees, why this, why that. So, and I think it's also very, very important for us to capture this knowledge, and as we create, they say if you don't know where you're coming from, then probably you don't know where you're going, and also for Africa to add to the collective memory of humanity. Our contribution is our culture, is our traditions, is our indigenous expressions by our ancestry. And it doesn't have to be old, because we are in contemporary culture today, but we need, if we're just going to consume, then we will be lost as a generation. So the idea for us, if we're going to contribute to that memory, we need to be inspired or to draw from the wealth of our ancestry, from the wealth of our cultures, from the wealth of our traditions. And there is no desert, because these are rich, and I mean, look at medicine itself. Many years Buganda was conducting C-sections. Imagine in Mali, they're already seeing the stars, the constellation.
While we wait for the questions, maybe Sunny, you can speak about how your work has evolved over the years. Is it easier to share your work now? How is it easier to share work now? Was it working at the start versus now?
So I've been working within this sort of like fashion space, this fashion and textile space now for the past 17 years. So with that, a few things become easier because of how much time I've sort of like spent within this space. My interests within the space have also really evolved over that period. When I started working in fashion, I was interested in styling and the ways in which clothing is animated and activated on the body. And I worked as a stylist for a couple of years, I think maybe 6 or 7. And then I slowly moved into working as a creative director. And I did that. And while I was doing that, this interest in curation and the discovery of curatorial exercise within fashion and textile really resonated with me quite deeply, because I think that my interest in fashion has always leaned a little bit more academic, which kind of caught me by surprise. And so, yeah, very, very slowly got into work, so like some curatorial projects, and that's been growing. It's a slightly unusual way of working, because it's like, I always like to give the example, it's like working sort of like front facing side of fashion, but also like the back house of fashion. So again, because my interest expands into how the systems of the production of fashion and clothing operate, what does distribution look like? Those are things that I'm always really interested about, because there's many eco-social, political things at play in those dynamics. So the short answer is, like, some things have gotten easier, and some things have gotten a little bit more complicated. I think, given the nature of this work and the extensive research that's required, sometimes it can be quite disheartening, the things that you come across in your research, the things that you find out about that have been lost, or that are at the risk of being lost, and everything is urgent, but then you have to prioritize. And I think that that can be a difficult space to be in. You know, anyone and everyone who works in decolonial work will tell you that the work of decolonization and being in that space is incredibly difficult, because the material is really difficult to interact with, right? And so, yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. Which I'm sure is something that also, because you really work in that space of decolonization, and I'm sure that, I'm curious how that is for you.
Dealing with the decolonial world, I mean, it's heavy. It has been heavy to deal with it. But sometimes I just look at the overall, or try to find the beauty in the work. But often there are times that I would need a space away from, especially like reading text from the colonial period. It's so offensive, I don't even know how it was published. So sometimes I do need to really either take a break, or just like really mentally remember what I'm doing the research for. Looking for the beauty instead of focusing on the negative bit of it.
Yeah.
So I think we have come to the end. I think Xenson is not able to join us back. But thank you so much, Sunny, for this. Thank you, Kai, for organizing this conversation. I think we can all say that we've learned so much from everyone here. And thank you, everyone, for making time to listen to all of us. Thank you so much. And this recording will be on YouTube, so you can come back and have a watch again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chep. Thank you so much, Sunny and Xenson in absentia. We do have to admit we had a bit of technical hitches, hence why we had like a coming in and out and a dropping off at some point. And thank you so much for your patience. I think I personally enjoyed the session. I think it was quite illuminating, and this was essentially what I had expected for the conversation to be. So as Chepa said, this conversation was recorded, and we'll have it available on our YouTube and also on our website. And the exhibition is open until the 13th of July. We are open on weekdays from 10 to 6 p.m. and Saturdays from 11 to 6 p.m. Thank you for your time again and participation and patience again. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it.